All right, guys, and welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. We truly are in awe each week, each and every week, to see you guys attend such an important conversation in today's climate. As we continue conversations on race and policing, the series, today we have a very special uh, um, event today where we'll be talking to members of our LGBTQIA community in regards to criminal justice system in today's society as well. So um, before we get into that, you always know we always start our show off with our CSUSB's land acknowledgement. As you all, some may not know, that CSUSB does sit on tribal land, and as we give events, and we just always like to pay homage to our tribal relations that we have here on campus to the land in which we sit on. So it goes as we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University of San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use of occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold CSUSB more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous people. So thank you. And as we started in our show last week, um, we are going to turn things over to Yvette, my co-host, where we'll be going into recent events, just an update of different things that's going on around the world, the things you may not know of or haven't had a chance to um, see it through, if not. So, Yvette, you're up.
Hi, I'm so happy to be bringing a little bit of good news every time we do these little sections of the show. So actually Dr. Texeira brought this up to my attention. It's about LAPD officers who had been charged with fabricating evidence that would indicate gang association for an individual. And that's been used against a good amount of innocent young men here in California. And so the good news is that that platform, which is known as CalGang, has been barred from any police use at all. And so it's going to clear up a lot of false stories against a lot of innocent young men. And so that's a silver lining to see about that situation. In one of our previous sessions that we just had, a viewer asked about the protests in Portland and how protesters were being met with federal military entities. I wish I could have found a little bit more good news on this. So far, we do know that the ACLU, along with community members, have made progress to bring a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Federal Protective Service, and U.S. Marshal Services. They're bringing this lawsuit against them because they believe they violated the 10th Amendment, which states that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Basically, the federal government is constrained by the Constitution from having federal police police the city of Portland. It's supposed to be separate. And so they want a court order that restricts the federal officers' actions to the federal courthouse. And they're demanding that the federal officers identify themselves and have probable cause to arrest anybody who is protesting. Additionally, during the Black Lives Matter protests in May, protesters were subjected to point-blank rounds of rubber bullets. A lot of people were injured. At least 3 journalists were severely injured. Subsequently, former officer of Detroit, Daniel DeBono, is being charged with multiple counts of felony assault. And so we can look forward to a trial for him and hopefully getting justice for the people who were assaulted in that situation. I appreciate y'all listening.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you for those recent updates. So a few weeks ago, we had a guest on our show who recently passed. And without giving too much information away, we're gonna welcome Stan Futch up to deliver a eulogy today in a special moment to where we just want to shed light on this brother who does so much for this community of San Bernardino. And I don't even want to give too much away. Stan Futch, please, if you can.
Thank you so much for having me again. For those that don't know, I am Stan Futch from the Westside Action Group. I'm the president of the organization. The group's been around since 1970. And Yvette touched on something that was amazing. The Westside Action Group started because of the mistreatment of African-American students at Cajon High School when it first opened up. And much like in Portland, the mothers went up there to defend for their students. And so the fathers saw that, they went up there and they joined the mothers like they did in Portland this last week. And I thought that was very fitting because it parallels 50 years ago, Westside Action Group did that, and here we are 50 years later, and they're doing it again in Portland, which is honorable. After that, Westside Action Group got involved in the community and also got involved into politics. And so they changed their name from the Fathers. The ladies group was called the Mothers. The men's group was called the Fathers. They changed their group to the Westside Political Action Group. And then they later dropped the political and they called themselves the Westside Action Group. And now a lot of people know us by WAG. WAG took a big loss this week with the loss of Don Griggs. I'm not sure who was on the last time, but Don Griggs was on the show a month ago, and it was devastating. Don Griggs called me and he said he thought he might have the coronavirus. That was 2 weeks before he passed. He was sound and full of energy, but he said that he got the temperature and he's got a little cough and he thinks he might have it. And 2 weeks later, the man was dead. So I'm saying this like that because I think it's very important for young people and for all people to know this thing is serious. It's killing people. I don't know if you know anybody close to you that's passed away, but this was devastating to me. This guy had such a life, and I will go into his life. Don started out and he went to the University of Iowa. There he wrestled. If anyone knows anything about college wrestling, Iowa is the #1 wrestling team in the nation. Iowa has a history that goes way back. After that, he joined the Marines. After the Marines, he became a supervisor at Edison, one of the first Black supervisors, especially in this area. Don was an entrepreneur. Don sold men's apparel. But what he was very well known for is he sold men's ties. Don had made beautiful ties, and I'll just show you one of them. One of my favorite ones is this tie right here. And Don sold ties, and everybody knew Don by his ties. And so much so that Johnny Cochran wore one of his ties during the O.J. Simpson trial. Don was a religious man and was very active in the church. But recently what Don did is he built a coalition, which he was the president of, called the West Valley Water District Ratepayers Association. He did that because things were going on in the West Valley Water District where he supplies his water. Things were going pretty terrible at those meetings, the board meetings. And what Don did is he stepped up like he does with many things, like he stepped up to join this group. Don was a part of this, and he would be here today if it wasn't for his passing. He stepped up and he turned that whole water district around. Now when you go to the meetings, they're held like normal meetings, like we're having our meeting here today. They hold meetings like this now. But in the past, they held meetings where people were hollering at each other, people were calling each other names, people were mismanaging the funds, and Don started this organization and president and led it And now the water district is under an African-American, Channing Hawkins, and it's moving smoothly and very well. And a lot of that is thanks to Don and his longtime running buddy, Hardy Brown. And so Don was a Renaissance man. He was a giant in the community. And I just want everyone to know that when I asked him to join this group right here, he didn't even hesitate. He wanted to be a part of it. I don't know if you remember last time he was here, he encouraged the young people to get involved. He encouraged you all to don't just talk about it, be about it. Go out there and join the city council. Go out there and make laws, do something. And Don he was indeed an action man, and he will be truly missed. And I thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Stan. Our condolences is very much with the Griggs family during this time. And just another reminder to be cautious out here. This disease or pandemic is a very real situation. You know, contrary to many people believe, we have to stay vigilant out here and protect one another. So please be cautious when we go about our days and our lives. And just again, our condolences goes out to the Griggs family. That was such a powerful episode that we had just a few short weeks ago, where we did get to talk about, you know, the steps going ahead, steps going forward, and you know, what should we see in our communities, and uplifting the young people in these communities to reach for the stars, you know. And that's something I'll forever be grateful for him having the chance to speak with us and being in this light in this moment, especially in these times as we go forward with our CSUSB community, and you know, I hope for a better future and returning into school, returning to, you know, the physical education side of it. So thank you so much, Stan. I am going to pass things over to Yvette, who's going to introduce our first guest today. So Yvette, if you're ready.
Hi, so our first guest is Manijeh Badiee, and she's an associate professor of psychology at California State University, San Bernardino. Thank you for coming and sharing your insight and sharing your perspective. So if you want to go ahead and take the floor, we're really eager to have you here with the conversation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Marlo and Yvette. And first, I just want to thank you all for having these conversations. And I'm a huge fan, and I've been following these dialogues. And so I will try to watch them when I can't catch them live. I try to watch them recorded. So I'm very excited and humbled to be here with y'all today. And I love the focus that you've had on race and policing. And I think that this just ties in so well in terms of just intersections of race and sexual orientation, gender identity. And so I'm excited to talk to y'all today. So I wanted to start off just because I'm not sure if people know some key terms related to the LGBTQ community. And so I wanted to just give a little bit of an intro to those terms. I just want to caution, this is just a very basic intro, and I really encourage you to look into this yourselves, take classes on LGBTQ movements, read books. There's lots of great literature out there. I think we're going to be sharing resources today as well. If you're, for students, we have the Queer and Transgender Resource Center here on campus as a wonderful resource to learn more. They have awesome events. So please this is just a very basic introduction. So first of all, what do these letters mean? LGBTQIA. So many people know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, they know those specific terms. Transgender, so those are pretty common. Queer is often the Q. Sometimes that's also questioning, someone who might be questioning their identity. Queer is a term that is considered to be what's called an umbrella term. So often people that identify as different, they might identify as you know, lesbian, for example, but also as queer. So for example, I identify as bisexual, but I also identify as queer. And queer is sometimes associated with a sort of subversive feel, like you're kind of out of the mainstream, you know, you're subversive, kind of like this more radical. Sometimes it's more defined that way as well. So it has a little bit of a political definition. And then questioning is someone who's in the process of questioning their sexual identity. And then intersex, that's another umbrella term for people who biologically don't necessarily fit into our very strict binary of what we have of male and female in our society. And so people who are intersex biologically don't necessarily fit into male or female. So in terms of like maybe anatomy or just other hormones or other characteristics, they don't necessarily are not necessarily biologically classified as male or female. And then the A stands for asexual, often. So asexual people are people who, there's, again, this is not another umbrella term. These are very complex terms with lots of different identities within them. But people who, you know, have like are on more of a spectrum of, you know, not necessarily having romantic orientations or not necessarily having sexual attractions, but there's a whole range within that. So it's not as simple as like you don't or you do. There's, again, that's a big umbrella term, and it's very complicated. And then ally, sometimes the A is also used for ally as well. So someone who is not in the LGBTQ community, but identifies themselves as an ally to the LGBTQ community. So sometimes that's also included. And then sex versus gender. So a lot of people think these are the same thing. Sex is assigned to us at birth. So when we are born, generally based on our anatomy, we are given the, you know, usually like maybe a doctor decides, okay, this person is male or female. So that's actually assigned to us. We don't choose our sex, it's given to us. And then gender is different. Gender is the gender that we identify as. So we might be assigned a particular sex, but then the gender that we identify is different. So people who are born, like assigned a sex and their gender matches are referred to as cisgender. So for example, me, I was assigned at birth as a female, and I also identify as a female, so therefore I would be considered cisgender, versus let's say I was assigned female at birth, but I identified as male, or let's say I don't identify within the binary, like maybe I identify as gender non-binary, for example, which means I don't really consider myself like fully male or fully female. So that I might also be consider myself transgender as well, because my sex that was assigned to me, again, chosen for me, not something I chose myself, is different than the gender that I identify as. So that's an important term. And then, so as I was saying, like if your sex and gendered, the sex that you're assigned to doesn't match your gender, that's also the umbrella term for that, like the broad term is transgender. And so within transgender, there's a lot of different ways people can identify, like transmasculine, they can be gender non-binary. And so that's also an umbrella term. So that covers a lot of different identities. They can be transgender women, you know, doesn't, you know, they could be different. There's different identities that fit into that umbrella. And so, and then there's also people that are gender non-conforming that also sometimes identify as transgender too. So people who don't necessarily conform to all the standards of gender and see themselves, again, more outside the binary, that, because in our society, you know, and in a lot of societies, we're very strict, like male, female, and what you're born, like what you're assigned, that's what you should be. And, you know, it's much more complicated than that. And it's the beautiful, you know, it's a beautiful thing, this complexity. And then, so in terms of gender, so there's the gender, like there's our gender identity, so what we identify as our gender, and then there's our gender expression, so how we might express our gender. So for example, like as I was saying, I identify as a woman, but I have very short hair, and actually if you saw me a month ago, it was completely shaved because like, and so I was very like a haircut that looks more, in our society would be labeled as more of a masculine or male haircut, right? So my gender expression, maybe in that case, was more masculine, but my gender identity is a woman. So that, I'd say that because sometimes we think you can tell someone's gender just by looking at them, but you really can't, because I mean, sometimes you can, but like that's not necessarily a perfect system, because what you're seeing is how they might express their gender, which is different from the gender that they might identify as. And so, you know, I think one of the things that has been a common theme with these conversations is this idea that we are so entrenched in the US in this white supremacy system, and it's such a big part of, you know, so many things. And in this case, we're talking about policing. You know, in a different perspective, there's also this systemic piece of heteronormativity. So we also live in a very heteronormative system, which means that, you know, just like white is the default, white is the ideal, white is the norm, heterosexual is considered the default, heterosexual cisgender is considered the norm. Those are considered the ideal, the default. And so, so this is pervasive in lots of different levels of society. This idea of heteronormativity, you know, when you think about, when people often think of a family, you know, they often think of, you know, a more traditional kind of a heterosexual family, you know, and so, or when, you know, and so there's all these ways that this plays out in society. And then so with that, there comes like homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. So this is oppression that's faced by people within this community. And they're going to be different depending on how you identify. You know, someone who's asexual is going to experience different oppression than someone who's transgender, than someone who is, you know, maybe lesbian. And, you know, obviously you can have different identities within this. So it's not like you know, you have your sexual orientation and then you also have your gender. So, so you could be oppressed for multiple things. You know, you could be oppressed for being transgender and queer, for example, or being a person of color and being a lesbian. So there's, so these kind of get compounded. So when we're talking about racism, you know, often that for queer and transgender people of color, that's going to be compounded by, you know, biphobia, homophobia, transphobia as well. So these get very, like the issues that people face get very exacerbated when you have multiple marginalized identities. So that's just a little bit of key terms. And I wanted to talk a little bit about just what being a queer person of color means for me personally. And I can just speak for myself. I'm Iranian American, bisexual woman. And I want to talk about what that means for me, as well as being cisgender. So for me, it means that I've sometimes had to choose which identity I'm going to bring into the table. You know, obviously my appearance like gives people the impression that I'm, you know, a racial or ethnic minority. So I can't necessarily completely hide that. But when I choose to, let's say, go in a queer, you know, LGBTQ community, sometimes I've been in spaces that were predominantly white, and I felt out of place. Similarly, if I'm in a space that's, you know, a very, you know, person, like places where I feel really safe as a person of color, sometimes those are places that I don't necessarily feel as safe as a queer person. So sometimes for me, not as much in California, I found a bit more community here, but definitely, you know, coming from Texas and Nebraska, I definitely had, like, I felt like a lot of times I had to choose which parts, you know, which part of my identity am I going to honor, you know, in this space, and which part feels okay for me to kind of bring out. Which is a privilege too of passing, because I have that privilege. Like I can hide that my queerness in a way that some people can't, you know. And so, so I think that's also a privilege in pass. There's a privilege in being able to pass as well. Being a woman means I have 1 in 5 chance of being sexually assaulted. Being bisexual makes it about 1 in 2 chance of being sexually assaulted, and being a woman of color puts me at an even greater risk. So in terms of violence, particularly sexual violence, being a bisexual woman, particularly of color, puts me at significantly greater risk than my heterosexual counterparts. And then also being cisgender, you know, there's privilege in being cisgender. I don't have to worry about my gender not being validated on a daily basis. I don't have to worry about the violence that my transgender siblings face regularly. And, you know, I'm not constantly subjected to that. And I'm much more represented in so many communities and so many levels of society. And so definitely the cisgender part gives me a lot of privilege and access in society. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of LGBTQ people and how it relates to policing, and because it's so tied to our community. It's very much tied to our community. Historically, LGBTQ people have been portrayed as deviants, plagues on society, and even as threats to national security. In the 1950s, in the McCarthy era, you know, people were terrified of communism, and gay men were being thought that they were going to be recruited as Soviet agents, and so they were being arrested. In the 60s, there was police officers that were extorting LGBTQ business owners, like down the street, and there was a donut shop in downtown LA called Cooper Donuts that was a popular meeting space for LGBTQ people. They were constantly being harassed by police, and so it became the site of an uprising eventually. There was also a police raid in Black Cat Tavern, another LGBTQ meeting space on New Year's Day in 1969. And so there was, that resulted again in more and more protests. And just to explain, like, the importance of safe spaces in LGBTQ communities is, I can't overstate that, because you don't often feel safe in, like, to, let's say, express affection towards your partner, or even just be yourself completely, without being worried about someone, you know, harassing you verbally, physically. And so safe spaces are so important, you know, spaces where you can just congregate and just, you know, hang out. And so these were the places that were being raided repeatedly by police during the 50s, during the 60s. And then, and one way these movements are tied is that there was a prison called the Women's House of Detention, and that housed a lot of people that were LGBTQ from 1932 to 1971. That actually became the site of uprisings later, and also in the Black Panther Party. So people like Angela Davis, Afeni Shakur, who also went to that detention center, that was an inspiration for them as well to say, like, oh wow, all the oppression of all these marginalized communities is so linked together, and that, you know, and then that resulted in more you know, connection between the gay liberation movements and the Black movements at the time as well. So all of these uprisings eventually led to 1969, June 1969 in Stonewall, New York City, where there was, again, lots of raids there happening, with police constantly raiding the Stonewall Inn. And so on June 28, 1969, there was a major violent, very, very violent raid. And so this became established, that led to a lot of protests, And so this became established as such a hugely significant event, led to lots of more direct organizing, and it eventually led to the first Pride March a year later. It really laid the groundwork for the LGBTQ civil rights movement. The people leading this Stonewall movement were largely women of color, largely LGBTQ Black women, and other women of color, people like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, Stormy Della Varghese. And so despite the importance of transgender women of colors, despite their importance in the movement, their contributions are often erased from our history. Like there was a recent movie about Stonewall, supposedly about Stonewall, in the last few years, but the leader was a white man. And so it's been, the LGBTQ history has been incredibly whitewashed, but women of color have really led the way, and I really owe so much gratitude to my queer elders, and particularly the women of color that have come before me, because they have, fought. So now, more than 50 years later, queer liberation is still very much tied to the resistance of violence, and particularly the resistance of police violence. LGBTQ people are still the victims of violence. 1 out of 5 hate crimes, according to the FBI, is due to sexual orientation or gender identity. A national crime victimization survey found that between 2012 to 2016, 300,000 LGBTQ people were victims of hate crimes. And the majority of victims of hate crimes against LGBTQ people are transgender women. So 72% of those hate crimes are against transgender women. 67% are transgender women of color. So over 2/3 of the hate crimes happening in our community are against transgender women of color, which is completely unacceptable. And So in terms of just specific issues though that are faced by our communities, so LGBTQ people are incarcerated at rates 3 times higher than the heterosexual population, according to a Lambda report. Also, nearly half of LGBTQ people who have contact with police report excessive force, unjustified arrest, or entrapment. Specifically, the issues faced by LGBTQ people include harassment, profiling, over-policing, and homophobia and transphobia within agencies. So harassment, nearly half of LGBTQ people have experienced harassment at the hands of police. 58% of transgender people have experienced this, and this includes verbal, physical, sexual harassment. Half of transgender people would not contact the police in the case of an emergency. So imagine, like, obviously I don't have the numbers for transgender people of color, but I imagine that would be even greater. Transgender people of color are 6 times more likely to experience physical violence at the hands of the police than white cisgender survivors and victims. Also hostile attitudes is another thing people face, LGBTQ people face. 1 in 3 LGBTQ, well actually first, 1 in 5 of all LGBTQ people face hostility by police, but 1 in 3 LGBTQ people of color. So significantly higher, and also 1 in 3 transgender people. And so there's a lot of assault, physical, again, verbal. Transgender people are often misgendered by police, even when they're corrected multiple times and told this is what this person's gender is. They will often, continue to misgender that person. And then profiling, a lot of times transgender women of color in particular are profiled as being involved in sex work and are often targeted by police. A third of Black transgender, in a 2015 Lambda Legal survey, a third of Black transgender women and nearly a third of multiracial transgender women reported that an officer assumed they were sex workers and harassed them. And over policing, 3/4 of LGBTQ people have reported face-to-face contact with police in the last 5 years. And a lot of this is also due to the other discrimination that's faced within this community, like poverty, and so there's systemic factors at play as well. Homophobia and transphobia is also rampant within police agencies themselves, and sometimes these comments get made public. So there was a study that was done with Latina transgender women in LA County, and 2/3 of them reported verbal harassment at the hands of the police. So, so this is, right here in our backyard, this is happening. So there's lots of ways that these struggles are linked, and so I think that it's impossible. And I think now, even though like I think there's been a history of the people of color getting neglected in these movements, in the LGBTQ movements, but yet as you see, like there's lots of reasons that these are very tied together. Like these struggles are very tied together. So so I want to just go back real quick to close off my comments. I want to just go back to what I was saying about pride and how the achievements of people of color have been lost. And so a lot of people have had complaints about pride and how it's really lost its original spirit of activism and become a very corporate white event. So I think this year there's been some movement in relation to that. All across the nation, there's been these more marching for Black trans lives, essentially. So in LA, in North Carolina, in New York City, 15,000 people marched for Black transgender lives. So we're finally getting back to our roots. I think this is finally a moment in which we're going to get back to our roots and realize like these oppression movements are tied together, and we really need to work together. And so yeah, so that's it for me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. One thing yes, give it up. One thing I gained in working for CSUSB as a student assistant in our cross-cultural center is to constantly remind everyone from different backgrounds, different cultures, different histories of the similarities of that we faced in oppression in this country. So to hear you speak of that history and that knowledge, we're just all in this basket together, which proves even more how we need to come together now to fight this great fight to overcome and see ourselves on the other side as equal at the end of the day. So thank you very much for that. But speaking of the Cross Cultural Center, our next panelist, someone, every time I call him my boss, he always reminds me that he's just my peer. But this is a newcomer to the CSUSB campus, and someone I've developed a very good friendship with, working alongside with, and just having an affinity for, and just such a great heart for people that he just breathes life in every room he walks in, and he just want to see the greatness in you as a student, and you know how you transition into the world after your degree. So I want to give it up for our Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion, one of the newest members to the CSUSB family, my good friend, Jacob Chacko. I should call him now, newly christened Dr. Jacob Chacko. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you, Marlo. Thank you so much, Marlo and Yvette, and everybody for inviting me to be a part of this panel and for allowing me to share space and time with you all. I had to write my thoughts down because otherwise I'll go off tangent. So thank you, folks. Pride was a riot. As a younger person living in the suburbs of Chicago, let's be real, my friends watching from Chicago. If I said Chicago, people will come for my life. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. As a young person from the suburbs, I often made excuses to get out of church on Sunday to attend the local Pride Parade in Chicago's Boys Town. What an inclusive name, right? In June. Sure, it was fun in the beginning, but looking back, it was boring. After a myriad of politicians, rainbow capitalism spewed by just about every corporation, and cops in rainbow attire, I was pretty much done after a few years. Bored and over it. Fast forward several years since that time, and on June 28th of 2015, queer and trans Black folks marched in front of the Chicago Pride Parade and released the following statement with their die-in. On this day in 1969, Sylvia Rivera, a Boricua trans woman, threw the bottle that sparked the infamous Stonewall riot. A year later, she and Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman, co-organized the first Christopher Street Liberation Day March in New York City to commemorate the queer upheaval against police violence, which toured the Lower East Side, ending strategically in front of the New York Women's House of Detention. By 1973, only 3 years after the first march in honor of Stonewall, organization of Pride events around the country were taken over largely by wealth cisgender gays and lesbians, looking to transform the march that began in New York from a political protest to an opportunity for mainstream visibility. If you can't tell, we're gonna have a recurring theme here, folks. That same year, coinciding with homosexuality being removed from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental disorders and conditions, trans and gender nonconforming people saw themselves banned from parades and gatherings around the nation. The birth of the gay and lesbian movement began with the banishing of these members of the queer community still unable to assimilate. The very same people whose direct actions in Compton's cafeteria, Cooper's Donuts, and Stonewall had sparked the movement. For this die-in on June 28, 2015, Chicago Black, trans, and queer community members and allies came out to speak about the surveillance and criminalization of queer and trans Black youth and queer and trans youth of color in the city. Often the policing and surveillance from their own people and organizations that were out there to support them present in that very same parade. For me, queerness and gender nonconformity was once and always as a part of our society. I would argue that colonization and more European dominion around the world coerced religious and faith-based doctrine to dominate the subaltern, as termed by Homi Bhabha, to dictate, surveil, and eradicate anything queer and trans. I often think of Edward Said's Orientalism as a how-to the West understands as it colonized, I should say continue to colonize, and other peoples who do not fit into this framework. I came to realize these notions and concepts through my doctoral work, and in particular, a course on post-colonial theory taught by Dr. Cameron McCarthy. Most enlightening was a work titled, Can the Subaltern Speak? By scholar Gayatri Spivak. In modern context, folks watching, trigger warning Netflix, take for example the Indian matchmaking show recently released on Netflix. Queerness is slightly visible as a subtext of the show that is untouched, where caste politics and colorism are also omnipresent. Don't even get me started on the Islamophobia. What if I told you that there was no India? Yeah, what if I told you there was no India? India was created as a Western British imperial concept. Before, there were borderless kingdoms with trade and loose borders and issues of their own nonetheless. For studies and understandings on caste, I recommend organizations like Equality Labs and activists named Tenmuri Sundararajan. Equality Labs website has a study on caste in the United States. After I share my story with you folks, I will share the links in the chat. Back to me. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, I was often the one person of color in various LGBTQ groups and organizations. I spoke to corporate sponsors to donate and give support to various LGBTQ organizations like GLSEN Chicago, Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, while never really receiving any support myself as a then closeted queer person living in a radically dangerous situation at home. For me, time and time again, the folks with power from our own marginalized queer communities utilize surveillance and police as a way to keep us further under control, or as I often refer to as subaltern. The more involved I was in local organizing, the more I became aware of the politics of race and policing in my own context. I helped to organize some of Chicago's first Day of Silence and Night of Noise rallies in downtown Chicago in the late 90s, early 2000s with fellow students from local high schools. These were symbolic day-long protests representing the silencing of LGBTQ students that gained visibility, sadly, after the brutal murder of Matthew Shepard in 1998. Looking back, I can reflect on why many of the Black and brown, queer and trans youth felt unsafe and uncomfortable with police presence at these rallies, often brought by organizers of groups such as the ones that I was involved with. I often think about the many Matthew Shepards from our queer and trans communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities we have lost as far back as our existence. However, I dare not engage in Oppression Olympics. What is interesting to me is that several of our historic and modern day activists have had their queer identities suppressed or erased, such as Bayard Rustin, and our trans siblings have completely been erased from the picture, as the case of Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and the many others Professor Dr. Manijeh mentioned, up until recently. In closing, I share with you some updates from Chicago and some thoughts. The Chicago Pride protesters, in their statement made in 2015 die-in, asked for ending the policing of queer and trans youth, the opening of a shelter for trans and queer youth in the city, reopening of mental health clinics in schools, end corporate exploitation among the queer and trans community, i.e. the commodification of pride, among other requests. Well, fast forward to 2020, in a recent response to the current uprisings following George Floyd's murder in the Black Lives Matter movement and peaceful protests, the current openly gay mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, imposed a curfew on downtown Chicago 35 minutes prior to the curfew going into effect. All the while shutting down the subway, known as the L, and buses. This whole transportation system is called the Chicago Transit Authority, CTA, lifted the Chicago River bridges, essentially blocking in protesters and passersby, many whom are queer, trans, and undocumented, as police surrounded them and closed in. As one tweet mentioned, so the CTA is not running, the bridges are up, and we expect people to be home for a curfew announced less than an hour before it goes into effect? Let people get home safe. This is ridiculous. Aside, I leave you with also my thoughts on liberation. Often we remember the image depicting a brown-skinned individual and two children behind a fence trying to watch a baseball game as explaining the difference between equality and equity. This image lacks to discuss the nature of white supremacy and how none of us are given a level playing field. Indeed, oftentimes it forgets about liberation and the complete removal of the barrier limiting the view. I urge you to look up and read the article, "The Equity Picture is Actually White Supremacy at Work," written by Sipping the Equity for your own learning. Remember that our liberation is tied to one another, is not alone, nor comes at the expense of others. In final closing, I urge you to look into the accounts of the brutal murder of Breonna Taylor and take action instead of simply posting and resharing on Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jacob. I always love working with you. You have such a heart for the students. I wanted to remind everybody to please go into the Q&A section and put any questions that you have in there, any comments that you want to have discussed later on in the webinar. Yeah, any questions or comments. So make sure you hit that Q&A so we can have a lot of good things to talk about. I'm really excited to introduce Toni Bryce. Thank you for coming on to the series. I have to congratulate you on this new series that you just landed with Stars. So you're amazing for that. It sounds super exciting. Toni here used her passion for acting from a young age and expanded on that in a way that she could uplift and educate her community. So if you want to go ahead and take the floor, Toni, we're so excited to hear from you today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So I am out of Atlanta. So hi, everybody on the West Coast. So I'm Toni Bryce. I am a Black woman of trans experience. I'm an actress, you know, a campaign model, you know, I think campaign because I'm not out here just being a regular model, so to speak. And I would say, you know, life has pushed me in the direction of being a trans activist as well, especially within the last 3 years. So yes, let's get started. So first of all, I just want to say, am I saying this right? Manijeh?
Manijeh.
Oh, I'm sorry, Manijeh.
That's okay.
Manijeh, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank you for, first and foremost, bringing all of the facts that you brought in the statistics, but also mentioning the names of Marsha and Sylvia and Miss Major, because those are 3 names that I always talk about anytime I'm on any platform. I think it's what people also should realize when we are, in terms of race, but when we talk about like Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter, are both like the origins of movements, at least within that era, I should say, like the civil rights movement and then the gay liberation movement was all like, it was policing, it was the laws, it was all of that. And I feel like a lot of times when it comes to our movement as a collective, as being Black people, Black trans folk are often erased and silenced and forgotten about. And so whenever I hear those names, it just brings me so much happiness because it lets me know that somebody somewhere has educated themselves on movements and people that were involved in those movements. And so in speaking in terms of like, going back to Black Lives Matter, for me, as of lately, I have been having a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, whether it being on the show that I host or whether I'm being invited to come have a conversation with someone else about the bigger movement of being Black people and our lives mattering. And then also, what does it feel like to be trans within that movement? And I do, I feel like for us, it's just, you feel like you are forgotten about. You feel like you are not mentioned. You feel silenced. You feel forgotten about. There's so many names I can name right now, and I will, but none of those names have been pushed to the forefront of the movement. And along with, you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I remember my earliest time of being an advocate or activist, so to speak, was when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And at my college, at Missouri State University, which is where I went to college, we held a march in the city of Springfield, Missouri. And that was like the earliest. And I just, as I'm thinking about like the things that I've been through in college, just being a student leader and leading people, being a friend, being a family member, I think now today, and I'm like, the same people that I have, you know, advocated for and tried to fight for, they won't be the same people that will advocate and fight for me. And that's something that I think I just have to not come to grips with and accept per se, but more so just to know, like when I'm going out to a Black Lives Matter protest, is because I'm Black. You know, my mama Black, my brother, my nephews, my sister. And so you're advocating, again, for a bunch of people that won't advocate for you. And so when we have our Black Trans Lives Matter movements and parades, I love to see that because I've seen that in New York and in different cities. But here in Atlanta, you're not going to see that. Like the Black Lives Matter Black Lives Matter here, they've been going every night since, I don't remember, I think at the end of May, I want to say, but they've been going every night. And I have now been invited to be on the task force for our Councilman Antonio Brown for District 3. And so I'm on this committee of civic engagements. And so and I'm one of 2 trans people on the task force. And so for me, it's about doing the work no matter what. No matter how erased or forgotten or silenced I feel like that I am currently whenever it comes to our movement, and also making sure that we are a voice in the conversation, that we have a seat at the table. And I feel like that has been one of the biggest things. I do want to just mention a couple of names. When we talk about just the overall movement, you know, Mercy Mack, Brayla Stone, Drea McCarty, Shaky Peters, Bree Black, Tatiana Hall, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fales, Toni McDade, Nina Pop, Monica Diamond, Lexi, and these are all Black trans women and a man that have been murdered this year. One particularly by the police, which was Toni McDade, which I'll get to that. But these are all names that you don't hear. Whenever you see movements, you don't really hear those names. You hear Breonna Taylor, and that's amazing. You hear George Floyd, that's amazing. But trans people that have also experienced injustice are not mentioned. And so I think a lot of times that's why not the resistance, I should say, but the hesitation for trans people to include themselves, because we're not necessarily included. And if you go on websites like Black Lives Matter, it talks about us being included, et cetera, because the movement was created by queer women of color. And so, but that doesn't mean that everybody with a blowhorn, everybody that's leading the charge for a particular march or whatever is going to be inclusive. I've seen so many Black Women Matters like rallies here and flyers, and none of them are including trans women. So I'm like, okay, so do I show up or do I not show up, right? And then people ask, like, how do you be supportive to trans people? And you say, well, my advice is always to show up, but then sometimes it's difficult to show up for other people when they don't show up for you. So what do? Do you still show up or do you not? And I think for me, it's about continuing to show up no matter what. So I feel like in terms of race, in the climate that I'm in now and what I've been experiencing, that's been like the biggest pull. I just feel like, and a lot of people talk about being included, right? I'm a Black person, I'm a Black body. I shouldn't have to be included. I should be required and automatically thought about because I am a Black body. These names I just named are Black bodies, yet they're not giving any recognition or any spotlight or any time to be talked about when it comes to the movement as a collective. So that's why things like Black Trans Lives Matter exist, because if the whole community is not advocating, at least those of that community need to be advocating. When we get into like policing, like I mentioned, Toni McDade. Toni McDade was a Black trans man in Tallahassee, Florida that was harassed and jumped by a group of men the day before, and then the next day was shot and killed by a police officer who said that he threatened him with a gun. However, local bystanders and witnesses said that never happened. And with Florida having the law that the police officer doesn't have to reveal their names, we don't even know who did it. Like, how can you kill somebody if we can't even know who did it, because a law protects you, but it doesn't protect us, right? And then when you get into, let's talk about the Latinx woman of trans experience, Layleen Polanco, who died in New York. She was in a solitary confinement, and she was supposed to be checked on every 15 minutes, and they let 47 minutes go by and she died. and had a seizure. And when they came, they were knocking on the door to see, you know, what she was doing, because they just seen her laying there, and they, you know, were outside of the door laughing and joking and doing what they were doing. And when they realized she was laying there lifeless, it gave like, oh. But that also shows, like, first of all, you put her, a lot of times solitary confinement for trans people, because, you know, when you're a trans woman, they're taking you to a men's prison anyway. And so they try to put you in spaces that are deemed, you know, safe, so you won't be harassed by male prisoners. She was allegedly, or put in there due to an alleged attack on a police officer. And, but yeah, she was supposed to be checked on, and she wasn't, and she ended up dying in their custody. And then when you talk about just like a lot of the names that I just talked about, a lot of these Black trans women don't have any justice. A lot of these cases are cold cases. A lot of these cases go underreported because of misgendering. There's a lot of misgendering. People love to misgender and use birth names and all of this kind of thing. Like, they just don't know how to be respectful and say, like, this is my name. These are my pronouns. This is my identity, and they don't know how to respect that. I think when you look at even marching with the collective, if I'm marching and if I'm taken to prison, I'm going to a men's prison. Like, I'm going to a men's jail. I'm going to be held in a jail cell. And actually my role coming up on P-Valley is going to mirror that kind of situation when it shows on episode 5. When we talk about the healthcare, like, we're no longer covered under the ACA anymore. When you talk about single-sex homeless shelters, now single-sex homeless shelters can apparently now identify characteristics of what a trans person looks like and can be discriminated against because they were not assigned the sex that other people in these shelters were assigned. Thankfully, when we look at now the Civil Rights Act of 1964, trans people are now included. And the third case came from Amy Stevens, where she worked at a funeral home, told her director that she was going to be transitioning, and when she returned, she will be she, her, and a woman. And they didn't like that, and they fired her. So she fought the case. She took it to the Supreme Court level, and she was one of the third case that helped get trans people, LGBT people in general, covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I feel like for me, I'm pretty much a homebody. I am, I stay home if I'm acting, if I'm going out to do activism, I'll do it. But I think now that I'm about to turn 30, the statistic being that, you know, the life expectancy of a Black trans woman is the age of 35 is really weighing on me. And I just had a friend the other night, she went out to a predominantly cis hetero bar. And, you know, when you're in these spaces, men love to come up and try to talk to you, et cetera. Because, you know, they see a woman, they see a beautiful woman, they're attracted, so they want to try and talk to you. And then when you disclose your truth or your authenticity, it's a problem. And it was a whole thing. And the man went as far as saying, you know, if such and such, if I would have took you home and didn't know this and didn't know that, you know, that would have been a bullet to your head, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like, we can't even, first of all, go out just to have fun with our friend groups without somebody talking to us, not us initiating it. And then when we voluntarily tell our truth, we're still verbally attacked, and a lot of times even physically attacked. And it's just a crazy time. And I feel like for me, being that I started my transition 4 years ago, I feel like it's pushed me more than ever to want to be more involved and want to look at what's going on, and to want to be an advocate and come out and speak on behalf of the community. Because again, if we're not doing it, who's going to do it? You just don't know. And let's see, when it comes to me and like what I'm trying to do for my community in terms of being an activist, is I look at it in all ways. Like, I've been on the front lines, I've been to the marches, I've done speeches at marches, I've held the blowhorn. But also I look at social media as definitely another platform to be an activist. And I host a show called Trans Table Talk every Thursday at 6. And what I created it for is just to really like give our community a platform to come on and talk about our experiences and amplify our voices, and know that there is a table specifically for us, and that any and all of us are accepted to come to that table and talk about it. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, being a part of the task force here in Atlanta for Councilman Antonio Brown out of District 3. So I am, you know, doing my part to try to, I've never been a political person, but definitely trying to do my part to offer my voice in terms of trying to change laws or help change something to better our experiences here. And yeah, so I feel like, I think that's pretty much it. I also want to say too, all of our, like as Black people specifically, all of our liberation is wrapped up and tied into each other. Like if not all of us are free, if a part of us, a part of our community is not free, then we can't be free as a collective. Like our liberation is wrapped up and tied up into each other. And I think the faster people understand that, the faster I think we can be unified. When you talk about Bayard Rustin, he was the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, and he's often erased out of that conversation because he was a Black gay man. And when I think about the Black movement, I'm like, if they did that to Bayard Rustin, who at least is a man, you know, he happened to be gay, but, you know, a cis man at that, why, you know, of course they would do that to Black trans women and to Marsha and to Sylvia. And thank God for Miss Major, she's still around. She'll be 80 years old this year, and she's still around to be able to continue to advocate for the community and tell her story and her experiences from the Stonewall back in 1969. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. I thank y'all again for having me, and I appreciate it. And I guess watch P Valley on SARS.
Thank you so much, Toni. Your uplift and your perseverance is definitely one to be appreciated, even in times where you don't see support being shown as you show it. So to be able to persevere through all of that, and your use of family, how you spread that, and want the need to protect others and speak on behalf of others, that just radiates through. And that's what we need. And that's what we have to continue to do. Even when, you know, it's not a paycheck we're looking for, it's not acknowledgement, it's just to help others get through. And so we thank you for that. Definitely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for being here. We'll definitely have a chat more in a second. We have one final panelist, guys. Thank you for sticking around. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. We have one final panelist, and I'll be introducing Angela Asbell. She's a lecturer here at CSUSB in the English and Gender and Sexuality Studies here. And they're also a local community organizer and an artist. She's a local community organizer and an artist. So without further ado, Angela Asbell.
Hey there. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I first want to say I'm really excited to be a part of this series. I've been following it as well. I'm especially interested in examining policing from an abolitionist perspective and from a queer theory perspective. Like I mentioned, I do teach in gender and sexuality studies, and I teach feminist theory. I teach queer theory, and then I'm going to teach our very first trans studies course in the fall, just like in about a month or so, which like, whoa. But I wanted to talk primarily today about the queer and trans abolitionist approach to policing and quote unquote criminal justice. I really appreciate how everybody has helped set up, I guess, what it is that I want to say today. Especially none of us are free until all of us are free. From queer theory perspective, that's going to be our like bottom line. So I know sometimes people hear the word queer and we know that it's an umbrella term for different kinds of sexual orientations, romantic affiliations, and so on. But when I teach queer theory, kind of the number one focus is that you don't, and this can be seen as controversial, but it doesn't matter who you sleep with to adopt a queer position. And that is basically that the queer position is we always examine power. And that's very, very different than the mainstream kind of gay community that we see with gay celebrities coming out for the Human Rights Campaign and for Pride. that actually when we're looking at queer, we're looking at the idea of a system that is designed to dehumanize and to kill people. And that from a queer perspective, we're always looking at the most vulnerable people. So of course we're interested in how sexuality and gender play into this, but it isn't the only thing we look at. We could recognize that there are very privileged gay people who will still kind of advocate for a system that still would kill most of us. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, for a lot of us, we look at somebody like Ellen and we're like, oh, visibility, right? But who does that really help? And so the queer perspective is like, gay marriage, what does that actually do about bodies on the ground that are being murdered, right? So we take a perspective of the idea of policing to begin with is a foundation of colonialist empire, that when you try to police people's gender expressions and their sexualities, that is fundamentally white supremacist and colonialist. So when we're looking at it from a police abolition perspective, the idea is, how do I describe this? I've been spending all this time writing, and of course now it's down to it. How do I describe it? If they're not here to protect us, then what are they here for? Police show us every day whose lives they value and whose lives they do not value. So it's hard for me from a queer political perspective to not advocate for getting rid of police entirely. And I know that shocks people, that there's always these kind of like, well, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? And the idea is, well, what are they doing about that anyway, right? In what ways are trans women, for example, for people of color, in what ways are police actually helping us? What about when we're a victim of a crime? How do we have to interact with police, and how do they kind of push our issues to the side, right? So a metaphor I kind of like to use, or an analogy, is, you know, I'm not the first person to come up with this, right? But it's this idea of like, you know, is the system working the way it's designed? Or do you think that the system is fundamentally fair and okay, but just needs to be tweaked or changed a little bit? So I pose that question to my students a lot, and it produces really amazing debates. Of course, there are students who say the system has issues, but it's fundamentally fair, and they want to go in and they want to fight to make policing better, or make all of our society better, right? They want to eliminate like racism in education or racism in healthcare, and those are important things. But when I pose this question, there's quite a few students who really can't think of any way that the police have ever helped them. Or they think about how they would never call the police because they know that the police would actually cause more problems. And it becomes really interesting, especially because we read Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? And they end up, there's always quite a few people who come to this position of like, the prison industrial complex was built and is working exactly as it's designed. And they don't actually have any faith that this can be reformed in any way. And there's usually a pretty vocal advocacy around abolition. And it's something that I'm glad that is becoming more a part of the conversation as we're all attending protests and trying to make sure that people's lives are being taken seriously, that people like Breonna Taylor will finally get justice, whatever that means, right? But they're willing to look beyond carceral, basically, solutions to justice. How do you produce justice when you're taking people and putting them back into a violent situation with no help and no resources? If we know that the police target anybody who's different, right, and other, then how can we support these systems in that increasing dehumanization? So I wanted to show you a couple of resources that we look at in my classes, if that's okay. I'm gonna share the screen if that's all right. Okay, let me see here. Please don't pay attention to all of the tabs I have open. It's embarrassing. The first I wanted to show is that Angela Davis's book is so, I mean, I don't think to this group that I have to like talk very much about it, but maybe to people who don't know, you know, Angela Davis would be considered to be like our mother, our godmother of prison abolition. Especially around the ideas of Black feminism and looking at intersectionality and how feminism has become a tool or can be a tool of empire and white supremacy. I want to say that basically, like when I show something like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project's kind of flyers about criminal injustice, as they term it here, that they are heavily influenced and, you know, and honestly work with Angela Davis all the time, right? So one of the charts, and I will send the link out to these as soon as I'm done speaking. It's one of 3 charts that if you take a look at Sylvia Rivera Law Project resources page, then you'll see some information, particularly specifically around New York, because that's where they're based, that you can actually find a lot of resources for incarcerated people and for trans people and kind of legal assistance. So if you see these flow charts here, they wanted to make a very clear way of showing how trans people are disproportionately targeted for deportation and for incarceration, and how poverty and homelessness are tied to that or connected to that. So I wanted to actually start with that one. I'm not gonna read everything. Like I said, I will show, or I'll send the links out, but this is a really good way to kind of show how if you have systemic injustice, that there are ways that we can actually solve or change this systemic injustice, but we have to actually look at the roots. So we know that if somebody is gender nonconforming or queer, that they will face barriers to their education, right? That they're at risk for homelessness, that all of us have really precarious healthcare, but especially queer and trans people have precarious healthcare, and that we're often relegated to low income or no income because of discrimination. And what I like when I'm showing my students this are the ways that this kind of individualist paradigm of like, just be good and lift yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, how kind of ridiculous that sounds to say that, or even to say, well, let's just reform things, when it's like, it's not just about reforming the police, it's about making education available to everyone. It's about making healthcare available to everyone, making sure every person has shelter and freedom from violence, food, clothes, right? And that if you are caught in a system in this way that's basically putting you there because of your gender or your sexuality, it's not so easy to just rise up and suddenly do well by your own sort of talents, right? Of course, people are amazing and all the time, definitely pulling ourselves up and trying to do better and to make change, material changes for people. But these kinds of charts show how difficult that is, and why a lot of my students do eventually come to the idea of abolition when they're taking a look at the system that is in place that it seems to them is directly in place to harm them, basically, and to show that their lives don't matter. So here, this is about how there are gender-related harms suffered by people, by trans people within the criminal justice system, and that we know that poor and homeless people are already criminalized. I mean, if you think about it, being homeless is kind of like illegal, right? Like, if you don't have a private property to go to and you're trespassing on public property, in what ways do we already make homeless people like targeted for incarceration? And then the ways that trans people are criminalized, maybe because of identity documents, false arrest for going in the wrong bathroom. And then, as a couple of people have mentioned, the way that trans women are targeted by police for soliciting. Or the idea is, I believe what I was reading was, if a trans woman is walking down the street and they find condoms in her purse, that would be proof that they're a sex worker instead of a safe sex individual, right? And so there's this disproportionately high exposure to arrest and harassment once you're in that system. Again, these are things that you can take a look at later. Another one that's very important when we're talking about policing is immigration. And so this chart has to do with thinking about how trans people are criminalized and the ways that when people are undocumented, that makes them especially vulnerable to violence and harassment and death based on their immigration status and their gender nonconformity. So again, that was from the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I'll send that link out to you. And then I just wanted to show you a couple of books that could be very helpful in this. One is called Queer Injustice. Let me see. Sorry about my awkward screen sharing here. So this one's called Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States. This is going to be a very formative book for you if you'd like to learn more about the ways that policing gender and sexuality are kind of a part of the American project, I guess we would say. And then a very influential book called Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment in the Prison Industrial Complex. This is, like, you'll see here that we have Angela Davis even endorsing the book because she works very closely with many of the people in this anthology. So it's like Captive Genders is an assemblage of analyses, manifestos, stories, interviews that traverse the complicated entanglements of surveillance, policing, imprisonment, and production of gender normativity. These books help to make connections for my students and for all of us around how policing is, we have informal policing around gender with the people we hang out with, like say at school, your peers, but the more formal policing that we see by police officers and teachers and counselors, that's a formalized kind of policing that is really harmful and can be, that we could call a form of genocide, basically, that there is a history of sort of white supremacist colonialist culture of taking any gender or sexual minorities and killing them. Literally, in some instances, that throwing them to the dogs, right? That people who didn't adhere to white supremacist ideas of gender and sexuality were quite literally genocided, like murdered. So I hope that what I was talking about right now made sense. I definitely feel a little bit like out of practice as a teacher for the summer right now, even though I am teaching a class right now, so that's embarrassing. But yeah, I just want to just kind of, I want to stop now and leave some time for questions. And thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Angela. Everything you had to share with us was very insightful and right to the point, which is what I really appreciate. So we're gonna go into our question and answer portion. One of the first questions we have up here, an attendee says they would love to hear Toni's thoughts on Black trans representation in media. Toni, did you want to respond?
Black trans representation in media. So I feel like we are getting to a place where I feel like we're getting to a place where it is going to be, well, when I think of media, I think of like, I guess in my world, like the film industry, but I think we're getting to a place of where we are not necessarily an afterthought. I feel like we are heading to a place where we are considered in the writer's room. I feel like we're in a place where not only are we considered, but we're being brought to the table to help further or create stories and narratives. Like I think of Janet Mock, and I think of Laverne Cox, and I think of the entire cast of Pose, and even other shows that have featured our series regular trans men and trans women a part of their shows. I think when it comes to the other form of media, like the blogs and things, I think that part, there's still a lot of things to learn. I recently had an issue with Hollywood Unlocked. So Selena Reyes Hernandez, the Latin trans woman that was murdered in Chicago by the 18-year-old student that left her house, came back to shoot her, left again, and then came back to shoot her again to make sure, I guess, that she was dead. They went to post that story, and then they further and went and seen a comment from some famous basketball player, reposted the story with a screenshot of his comment, which was very toxic and problematic. But one of the things is they use a picture of Rhea Milton. And then, you go into comments of things like that, and it's people misgendering her, people saying, oh, you can tell that's a man, and what, da-da-da, and da-da-da. So first of all, Hollywood Unlocked, not only did you use the wrong picture, but now you have this girl's family that's probably reading these comments, that has to relive a death, that has to probably mentally fight, and even physically within the comments go back and forth with these people. But nobody, that was crazy to me. So I had to somehow got in contact with the senior editor who made the post and let her know that was unacceptable. If you want to tell a story about a trans woman being murdered, first of all, make sure your source is relevant. Google is free. And also make sure you're using the correct pictures. And it was just a foolish post. And they took it down. So I think, and that's again part of the social media, being a part of social media, being an activist on social media as well, is you can see those things and you fight behind the scenes to make sure that your community and specific people within the community are not misrepresented, even though they were. And we had a really good conversation. So when it comes to that form of media, even the news, a lot of work still needs to be done, because there's still a lot of misgendering and wanting to use, whatever name is on the birth certificate and whatnot, and what you were assigned with at birth. So I think that's that side of the media. And then you have the other, the film side in terms of that version of media. And I think the film side is doing way better than the other media, the news media side. So I hope that answers the question, but that's my little 2 cents on media and visibility in media.
Were there any other panelists that want to speak on Black trans representation in media?
I just wanted to say that Laverne Cox's film Disclosure was really impactful for me to understand more about transgender representation in media. So I really recommend that film. It's on Netflix.
I agree.
Thank you. And Angela, Asbell, thank you as well for your presentation. That was definitely informal. We're gonna keep the Q&As running, and guys, just a reminder to hit that Q&A button as we get into this open discussion side of why we're here, to keep these topics rolling, and it reminds you that it doesn't have to be on something that the panelists spoke on today. Even if you just have a question or concern in your own community or in your own set of peers and family, and you may just want to try to get an answer from our panelists here today, just hit that button and let us know what you're thinking. So we're going to keep the Q&As rolling. I saw one here that was directed at Badiee. I hope I said that right too. But okay, here we are. So the question came, it said, there we are. Dr. Badiee, how does the treatment of LGBTQ community differ in your native country of Iran compared to the United States? Is it worse, better, or indifferent?
So it depends on what, depends on what group you're talking about. So when it comes to same-sex relationships in Iran, it's illegal. So you basically anything it's a type of government where anything outside of like a heterosexual marriage is considered to be illegal, and you could be punished, possibly punished by death, but that's not as common, but you could definitely be punished. So when it comes to same-sex attractions, it's very hidden. You know, obviously there's people that have same-sex attractions, but it tends to be very, very hidden, like a lot of things within Iranian culture that you have to hide from the government. When it comes to trans folk though, so I want to just first specify that, you know, there's a lot of different ways, just like there's a lot of ways to be queer, there's a lot of ways to be trans. So not everybody that's trans necessarily wants to get surgery, but some trans people do pursue gender confirmation surgery, and actually Iran has the second highest number of gender confirmation surgeries in the world after Thailand. So actually, in terms of gender confirmation surgeries, it's more accessible than here in a lot of ways, but it's also complicated because there's other privileges that go into it. And really the reason that I think it's easier to get gender confirmation surgery there is because they actually prefer that to being queer, because they think like to being queer and non-trans, because they think like, oh well, we're gonna push you into this binary so that at least you can have this like kind of heterosexual family type of thing. So because there's a kind of a push for that. It's not that necessarily transgender people have it easy or they're not, you know, discriminated against or anything like that, but just in terms of access to the surgeries for people who want to have access, there is greater access there. But in other ways, you know, I think just given the government, there's a lot of oppression that's generally faced by LGBTQ people there, so.
Thank you for that answer very much. You provided a lot of really insightful perspective on your end. And yeah, we appreciated you coming to the conversation. I appreciated a lot what you had to say earlier, bringing the facts, of course, as Toni stated. So we appreciate that. We're gonna go ahead and continue with Q&A. I've got one here. So how does Angela respond to students who are concerned that without the police, a group of non-state actors will take their place in policing, or the concern that without the police, there will be no check on crime and in some ways hurt all communities?
Okay, thanks for that question. That's usually like one of the first questions that people ask when we talk about abolition. But it's important to think about the idea that nobody is really arguing that we're going and we're taking the buildings that are prisons and just letting everybody out all of a sudden and knocking them down with a wrecking ball. When we're, you know, these popular sort of discussions around defunding the police nowadays might be a good way to think about this. What Angela Davis is actually arguing is that why do we lack so much imagination that we can't imagine a society without policing? What she is more advocating for would be the idea that, like, what are the roots of crime and violence, and how can we create a society where where crime and violence are almost non-existent, if not non-existent, right? So in a way, it sounds very romantic, but it's a challenge for us to think about how we could reorganize our society in ways that meet the needs of people, of all people, and make a society where police are actually not necessary, right? So I know that people are always like, oh, that sounds really nice. What does that look like, right? It looks like community-based security, right? So if somebody is not acting right in your neighborhood, that we don't automatically call the police and have that person hauled off to a terrible place that's very violent, but instead work on all parts of education and counseling and job opportunities and shelter and food, that to the point where we can actually see the roots of where people are so either violent or so upset, and actually try to go, figure out how to bring justice for all people involved, right? So it is in a lot of ways very, I don't want to reduce it to something very small, but maybe if you could think of it this way, if a kid, if some kids are playing in a lot and they're playing baseball or something, and somebody hits a ball and it goes, goes through someone's window, right? How do we do that as a community, right? We would get together, we'd figure out how to get the window replaced and talk to the kids about being more careful, right? The system that we have designed now is very like, I'm scared, I'm gonna call the police, I'm gonna have someone else mediate this, which basically means that that kid would be subjected to more violence and being confined instead of just trying to figure out like where the conflict is, right? Yeah, I don't want to belabor it too much. I'm happy to talk more about it, but usually what I do is I just ask students to think about like, what kind of society do you want? And then how can we make it happen? And one of the main things that people are worried about is that someone else is going to come in and want to be the police, to be those bullies, to make that kind of function of like kind of armed insurrection. And we can't guarantee that people aren't going to try to do that. But if we build a kind of society that's strong enough, we would be able to resist those kinds of bullying tactics, right? Even with the simple, like, we don't do it this way. You know what I mean? Like, we don't, this is not how we do it. We do this in our society, right? So yeah, I know it sounds very romantic, but that's part of what Angela Davis is asking us to do, to deploy our smarts and our talents and our imagination. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, everything is on the table right now, so why not see it through? If the norm isn't working, we have to strip it and write a new norm. So definitely keep your imaginations open during this time, and definitely push the agenda of equality and justice, something we haven't seen for a long time, if not ever, here in the Americas. Our panelist Jacob posted something earlier. I want to repeat it for our audience today. Said we also want to give a shout out to the students who are interested in these topics to please consider exploring classes in gender and sexuality studies at CSUSB. They are available as electives and GE requirements. All of the classes by design examine and explore issues of social justice and intersectional identities, including race and social class. So definitely, if you're looking to educate yourself more upon these issues and these subject matters, definitely take this time. Oh, Angela, you had one?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm really proud and amazed that my feminist theory class and my intro to trans studies class, they're both full for the fall. It's so amazing. But stuff happens, so maybe you can keep checking in and see if you get in. But also I will be teaching queer theory in the spring. And this is where we really dig into these abolitionist ideas that we're talking about, hopefully more eloquently by then. But I just wanted to put a plug out there, and there's a ton of gender and sexuality studies classes available, not just mine. I just like plugging mine. So thanks.
Thank you. This is new to me because the only classes that I were aware of in that era were like women writers and things like that. So to have more of that on our campus, that just opens a whole nother door. So to even bring light to that now, I'm glad we are here to share that information.
Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does Mary still teach Black feminism? I think it was Mary who would teach Black feminist theory or something. And if she still teaches that, you got to take that class for sure. It's amazing.
I haven't taught it in a couple of years, but I do plan to teach it next fall.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for, I didn't even pay you for that, Angela. Thank you. I was just wondering if I can ask also a question. I'm getting ahead of the line here, but sorry. But it ties into media. And, I was really impressed with Toni's answer in terms of film. And I love Pose. I totally recommend that everybody see that. I have learned quite a bit from Pose. And I'm not talking about the Madonna whole thing, because everybody thinks she invented it, right? But I was wondering if anyone has seen Welcome to Chechnya. It's a documentary, a new documentary on HBO, I believe, and it talks about the problems with the LGBTQIA community in Russia, in Chechnya in particular. But these folks have, it's so bad there that they have to have like an underground railroad to get them out sometimes. And I had no idea that there were these brave people who were, who were helping members of that community get out of Russia and get out of Chechnya. So I highly recommend it. If I just thought maybe if one of you had seen it, maybe give your insight, but I guess not. I recommend it though.
Thank you. Me and my girlfriend were always up for new shows to watch. Pose was a favorite of ours as well. So if you're a fan of Pose, then I'm gonna take you up on that.
Oh yeah, love Pose, love Pose. Yeah.
But speaking of media and shows, Toni, I would like to give you a second to plug your platform on the upcoming episode that you'll be watching on the Showtime original, isn't it?
It's on Stars.
Oh, Stars. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So, yes, so first of all, let me say, my character, I come in on episode 5, so I'm considered the film world a co-starring role. So just one episode, but let's pray for season 2. I talked to the creator. She said the storyline is going to continue. So we'll see. But I also just, so P Valley in general is about a strip club in Mississippi. And just like coming from the female gaze, like beyond just like these women that are on Pose, swinging around Pose, it's really looking at pole dancing as a sport, as and then these women's lives, like what they go through behind the scenes, like what they're actually going through, what brought them to this space. And then the owner of the club, which is like a very interesting component to the story, is the name is Uncle Clifford. But Uncle Clifford is a gender nonconforming queer person who goes by she, her pronouns. And I was actually just having a conversation with somebody today. One of my trans sisters, one of her children, not by birth, but in the community, we, as Pose, Mother Blanca and Electra and, Candy and all of the people, sometimes we have kids, our chosen family. And so one of her chosen kids is like literally going through the same thing. So I just thought that was powerful for Katori Hall to create a character that was really inspired by people around her in her real life and put that on screen, because now somebody can say, I relate, I can identify with. And I actually told the person to watch Pose, or not Pose, but P Valley. so they can see the character of Uncle Clifford. My character, I guess I can't really say too much, but it's really kind of a comic relief type of character within the scene, but it's also a very serious situation, especially when we talk about policing and trans women being in men's holding cells, and so I can give that much, but and what that looks like. But yeah, P-Valley, definitely watch P-Valley, and again, I hope for season 2. This is I've been on TV since 2016, so I've been doing things since 2016, but this is like my official like debut as a character with a speaking role. You know, background and feature stuff. I did some commentating on a show for MTV, but this is like my official, you know, my debut. So I'm very excited, and we'll see what happens. So I'm just praying for, you know, season 2. I believe it's going to have a season 2 because the show is amazing. But for my character storyline, I'm praying for a season 2. So
that's
I'm
great.
excited. Thank you for that.
And congratulations. And also Thursday nights at 6 p.m., I'm assuming Eastern Standard Time. You have your I know you have your podcast, is it?
So I host a show called Trans Table Talk, you know, inspired by Red Table Talk with Jada Pinkett Smith and her mother and daughter. But yeah, so it's Trans Table Talk. We have it every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And like I mentioned earlier, it's just a platform to kind of give people that are within the community and probably like directly connected to the community, just a platform to speak on their experiences. Like tomorrow, we're going to talk about the life and experiences of a Black man who's trans attracted. And so we're going to be talking about that tomorrow on Trans Table Talk. So I'm very excited for that conversation. But yeah, I do that, and you know, just so many things I just have tried to do. Of course, COVID has stopped a few of the things that I've been doing, but you know, eventually. So this is something that I can do virtually to still keep people engaged and keep, you know, serving our community and educating from our people from our community or outside of our community.
Thank you. And where can our audience see that on? Is it YouTube or Instagram?
Facebook.
Oh, okay.
So Facebook, was I cutting out? I'm here.
No, we hear you.
Oh, you hear me? Okay. Yeah, on Facebook. So, I mean, you can add me on Facebook, Toni Bryce, Toni, or well, you see it up there, right?
Yeah.
So you can just add me on Facebook, and I do it on a different platform because it's kind of through I work for a community-based organization called NASM, and so I do it on their platform, and so it's really on their page, but I create watch parties from my page, so people can still tune in if they're not Facebook friends with the actual organization.
That's great.
Yeah.
We're truly proud of you and excited for your future as well. So I know Yvette want to jump in there, Yvette. I know you have a lot to say too.
No, just thank you everyone definitely for sharing. Each of your individual stories just came with so much conviction and a lot of truth from each of you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing on your own individual paths, all the work that you're doing for this community. And I really appreciate, especially everybody just really tooting this intersectionality. It's so important for us all to support one another. And it's thematic today, and I really love that it's thematic today, that none of us win if all of us are not winning. So yeah, I really appreciate all the work y'all are doing.
That's great. One thing we are as students here at CSUSB, we are resource sharers. So anything we know, we try to get it out so everyone can know. One question I want to pose upon the panelists tonight is the use of pronouns, because and I didn't start getting into pronouns and learning of the importance of them until about 2019 when I met Jacob, honestly. But it's almost equivalent to getting your name wrong, but in some cases it can almost be disrespectful to pronounce the wrong pronouns. How important is that now in our day society to be more aware of how we address our our LGBTQ community.
So important. And I would say as cisgender people, we need to take the charge and lead the way at times to introduce ourselves, use our privilege to introduce ourselves with our pronouns, to let folks in the room know that, you know, this is a space that we are going to introduce our pronouns and we're going to be affirming of trans and gender nonconforming people. And so in the chat, I did share pronouns, internationalpronounsday.org. That is a thing, so check it out. It is in October, International Pronouns Day, as well as resources on that page as well. You know, oftentimes people ask about, well, how do I ask someone for pronouns? Like you ask them for their name? Sorry, I'm throwing shade. But, but, you know, if something, you know, introduce yourself with someone's pronoun, and as you would when you make a mistake, apologize and move forward, right? The conversation is not centering it around yourself. It's, you know, and not making a scene or a scenario for the other person, for classroom teachers and for folks who want to be supportive. You know, talk to the person in private. If you have the opportunity, add your pronouns to your syllabus so that students know that you are approachable and can confide in you in certain situations, and they may feel comfortable chatting with you about these things. Feel free to chime in, folks.
I just wanted to like talk about a personal experience with pronouns and why they're so important. So I have a nephew. He is 5 now, and last time I seen my nephew, well, before this very last time when I see my nephew was her, she, and her, and she, and her, and she. And then this last time I seen my nephew, he said he. And I asked my brother and his mom, I asked my nephew's mom and my brother, I was like, so what kind of conversations are y'all having when I'm, you know, in front of him? Because that's never been a situation where he has not used the pronoun that I require, not prefer, but require. So like, what is that? What is that? And so they didn't know, because I don't know. So it's still kind of a mystery as to why the pronoun had all of a sudden changed. And I say that because it's important, because initially it might come from my mom, honestly, because when we've been around each other, it's certain things I think parents really struggle with when it comes to their kids and transitioning. And I think pronouns is a big one. And so she has gotten pretty, I guess, good with performing, so to speak, when we're out in public. But when we're with family, I guess she feels comfortable enough to still use old pronouns. And I feel like if anything, it may have came from her, and he may have heard her say something. But I've had to talk with her, and I'm like, if this child can see me and understand that these are my pronouns and respect them, and you as a grown adult cannot do that, that is a problem. And then furthermore, when this child is addressing me by a pronoun and you're using another one, that's confusing to them. So I'm not confusing anybody, you're confusing them because you're not using the right pronoun, and you know what the right pronoun is. So that was my personal experience, and that's why it's important to me as a person, but also like with children, like kids are taught, right, different things, right? And pronouns is something that can be taught if it's not already assumed. And so when it came to that situation, it really did like blow my mind. I was like, wait, what happened? Like, when has that ever been the case? So yes, people, respect pronouns, period. Respect pronouns. It's just like when you see, what is the phrase, respect is due to a dog. So if you can do that, like what's I don't understand what's so hard about respecting one another. You don't have to, you know, accept it, because first and foremost, you don't have the power to accept me. I've already done that work, so you don't have the power to do that. But you do need to respect people, and so that's the to me why it's so important is you need to respect people.
And I'll add at one point in time in ally trainings and LGBTQ trainings, yes, we did use preferred. We have moved that, the bus has left the station. We have moved on. It is not a preference. I'm sorry. Like, no, I'm not sorry. It is definitely not a preference. That is my way of being.
Right.
And even linguistically, some folks are using, for example, I know some folks who identify as Latinx who would use she, her, ella, or he, him, él in their pronouns as well. And some folks may not use pronouns that we've heard before, right? And that's okay. Some folks use their name as their pronouns. It is their lived experience. It is about them and not us, right? It is on us to learn about their identity, practice, like anything, practice makes perfect, right? Well, but practice and use it in your daily life.
Angela, I think, I completely agree with you in terms of abolition, the abolition movement. I've been reading Angela Davis for years in terms of prison abolition, but I had not extended that to policing. And obviously, members of the LGBTQIA community are getting hurt, harassed by the police. So what happens between, and anyone can answer this, I suppose, what happens between now and abolition? What do we do in the meantime? Are police trainable? In other words, I guess. So anyone can take that, I guess. You're muted, Angela.
I was just gonna say, I don't wanna take up like a ton of space. If other people have thoughts on this, I'm happy to let them go first or just go.
Toni?
Yeah, you have the floor.
Manijeh?
Go for it, Angela.
Okay, why not? Ooh, so that's a tough question. I in a lot of ways, I don't think, the first thing is that this has to be a collective change. So it's like, I have ideas, but it doesn't really, like, we all need to get together to decide how we do this. So I could tell you some of my own like personal beliefs, but I think what's more important is that people work collectively to decide what their communities need and put that focus there. So what I would say is it would involve actual like coming out of your house and talking with your neighbors and deciding what kind of neighborhood you want to have, and everybody hopefully being pushed a little bit to consider how much, first of all, that fear is part of how we make our decisions about this. And I don't mean that that's bad. I just mean like we need to sort out some real emotional and ways that we have relationships with each other first. Like, how do we work together? How can we work together in a way where people feel heard, that people aren't being silenced? I think something that's particularly interesting is the ways that people who have power can silence other people who are not as respectable or, that don't have the same degrees that some of us have. And so I think, one of those moves is trying to actually work together to talk about what people need in their neighborhoods, and then to build popular consensus. That has to be the way that we move forward with this. It won't work any other way. But personally, I think the calls to defund police and the military and to put that funding into schools is obviously, as an educator, going to be my number one thing. I actually believe, I'm probably also, I'm very critical of capitalism and its effect on education. So I would like to move the educational paradigm from this kind of, even in a public school, that it seems to be very profit driven. And when we talk about students and access to education, I noticed on our campus that students would literally say, I'm housing insecure. If you want me to graduate in 4 years, I need a place to live for 4 years that isn't ridiculously expensive. And what did we do? We're just like, oh, that's great. We'll just have you overload on your classes so you can graduate in 4 years. Like, I don't feel like everybody, this is probably, I don't know if I'm gonna get in trouble for this, but like, basically what I'm saying is, it has to be like trickle up instead of trickle down. So like, we have to start with our most vulnerable people and ask them what they actually need, and then work from there. So I know education and its connection to like transformation of your mind and job opportunities, right, would be really important to me. We have plenty of food to feed everyone. We have plenty of shelter to shelter everyone. We could work on transportation that's more accessible. You know, basically from the ground up is how I would see that happen. So I don't want to, like, again, I tend to ramble and I don't want to take up a bunch of space, but basically it's like kind of a trickle up model that we would talk about in queer and trans theory, like start with the most vulnerable people, and when we get them secure, then everyone else, you know, wins. So
thank you, Angela. And I just need to say, because I know that there are some skeptics out there listening to your utopia.
I know.
But I've encountered that too, and my answer's always been, if you cannot dream it, it doesn't happen. You have got to imagine a better world. And that's the reason we've been doing this every single week, because we want to imagine a world where my son, where, you know, sons of sharecroppers, sons of Supreme Court justices can walk down the street and not be harassed by the police. Exactly. You know, all of Bill Cosby's money did not, I'm not talking about this last case here, but there was a time years ago when he was walking down the street in Beverly Hills and the cops stopped him. You know, so all of his money did not protect him. So, you know, he wasn't free. None of us are free until, like Manijeh started, you know, until we're all free. So we have got to be dreamers. We have got to dream a different reality, because too many people are getting hurt. Too many people are getting sent to prison to just rot away in prison for, you know, for decades and decades. We still have some Black Panthers in prison today.
Yeah.
Still have Black Panthers. And Angela Davis would be in prison.
Can't come home.
Exactly. Yes, Assata. But Angela Davis would still be in prison if she hadn't been, I mean, if she wasn't going to be electrocuted, unless, I mean, unless there was a groundswell of activism to get her acquitted. But, you know, we have got to imagine a better world. I know that sounds, you know, like fairy tale and all that, but I'm going to continue to do it, because I think that's exactly what we have to dream of.
Who else? I mean, teachers, if anybody, we get that privilege, I guess, and artists and everybody, but I mean, where else are people going to do it, I guess, if they're not doing it in school?
Well, I mean, I would like to see it come from the, you know, the religious spaces, you know, faith communities, but, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of silence when it comes to talking about issues like this. You know, we have spoken about Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail in this forum before, and I would just, you know, it is just as relevant today as it was in 1960, whenever he wrote it, 1962, 63, you know, where he's admonishing these ministers, you know, you've got to follow the teachings of Christ, and you've got to step up here. Can
I say, a lot of it's problem solving too. And one of the things that WAG does is we do two different ways. One of the ways we solve problems or getting to the end result that we want is we'll send someone to the front door, but there's always somebody at the back door whispering in somebody's ear, trying to convince them that what we want done is the right way to do it. In other words, I don't know, I mean, I know a few of you know my brother John before he passed away. And John was always at the back door. John was knocking on everybody's back door. He was whispering in everybody's ear, but he knew what the front door wanted. And the front door, you go in hard, but the back door, you go in soft. And you convince, or you get them to accept the change at first. And then you convince them to buy into the change. And as you work that soft back door and you push that hard front door, eventually someone's going to listen or hear exactly what you have to say. So it's all a matter of problem solving and getting what you want done. And that's one of the things that I think this group has got to do. We meet and we talk and we talk and we talk. But in the end, a law has to be made that change is something that we're talking about. A organization has to be changed because we've talked about it and made the right moves. It's not enough just to talk. It's the action has to take place. And so I'm really for, that's what we do in WAG. We take action. And I think it's very important that when this group is all done, or hopefully it goes on forever, but when we get to certain places, we make changes in the school, the community, in the world. And so I think that's most important, that we need to come out of this, is make a change. Thank you.
Well said, Stan. Well said.
Can I add how much Mr. Futch, your brother meant the world to me. He is one of the most, he was like one of the only people on our campus who I really trusted. He had my back so many times. He was just such a great human being, and it really broke my heart to hear about his passing. I was just so devastated. He is one of the most genuine and amazing people I'd ever met. And I just want to offer my condolences. I know it's been a minute, but it was very shocking. And I want you to know how much I loved him. I love John.
I don't know anyone who didn't love John.
Seriously.
I don't know anyone who did not love John. He's such a good soul, good heart, good heart. Yeah, I think, Marlo, what do you think? We need to wrap it up?
Yes, and here we go. So as we approach the end of the show, guys, I want to thank all the attendees for sticking around, being such a part of this movement, this series, this change that we're sparking. On behalf of CSUSB student, faculty, and staff, I'd like to take this time to say thank you, Stan. Thank you for returning, and thank you for giving us the history on the late brother, Don Griggs. He would truly be missed. His voice, his presence has definitely had a shift in our community. And man, you've been surrounded by great excellence and leadership your whole life. So you keep sparking, brother. We right behind you. And to our panelists, Angela, oh my God, Toni, Manijeh, thank you. This was such an amazing show tonight, and I'm sure the audience agrees. One thing I do every week is read off one of the comments as well as questions. And one of the comments say, to all, thank you all for the information today. You are all making a real impact on me through these sessions and many other viewers. Also, the guests today were all very insightful, and I hope to hear more from you all, from all of them. So just to see that, you know, in our what we do is we each one, we teach one. And to see that, that's very powerful. It lets us know that our presence is being felt, and these sessions are much needed in this time. So thank you for reassuring us that from that attendee. And what we're going to do today is a little different. So before I bring Manijeh back up to the forefront, me and Yvette are going to sign off. Again, I am Marlo Brooks. I'm a senior English major studying here at CSUSB in the College of Arts and Letters. I'm almost out of the door there and ready to go fight on the front line with the rest of them. So Yvette, you want to give your final words as well?
So I'm Yvette RELLES-POWELL. I'm a comm major, minoring in environmental sciences. And I should be graduating this coming year actually myself, so I'm excited for that. I want to give a huge thank you to Jacob, Toni, Angela, Manijeh, and Stan for all of you coming on and taking time out of your day and sharing your stories with us so openly and so honestly. Once again, I think that takes so much courage, and I really appreciate each and every one of you for continuing the conversation. So let's sign out of here.
All right, and Manijeh is going to be coming back up to give us a final quote that I think you all should hear before we leave tonight. God bless you all. Stay safe. Reminder, each and every Wednesday, we're right back here, 4 p.m. Conversations on race and policing. Tune in. Thank you guys again. Manijeh, you're up.
And can I just say, Toni, we're going to look for you at the Academy Awards. Come on now. Come on. Think big, girl.
Thank y'all so much. I receive it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, thanks again. This was such a wonderful panel, and thanks to my co-panelists and the organizers for all this. This was amazing. I just wanted to end with a quote by Audre Lorde, a Black lesbian mother, warrior, and poet, and one of my sheroes, one of my personal sheroes that I think is very relevant for today that I wanted to close with. Once you start to speak, people will yell at you. They will interrupt you, put you down, and suggest it's personal. And the world won't end. And the speaking will get easier and easier. And you will find you have fallen in love with your own vision, which you may never have realized you had. And you will lose some friends and lovers and realize you don't miss them. And new ones will find you and cherish you. And you will still flirt and paint your nails, dress up and party, because as I think Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. And at last you'll know with surpassing certainty that only one thing is more frightening than speaking your truth. And that is not speaking. Thank you.
Wow. I love it. Love it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Stay tuned. Stay tuned next week. We are going to have another dynamic program. Not as dynamic as this one. It could never be as dynamic as this one. But thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. We'll be seeing you on the internet. Bye.